Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus and the tension of being in the world, but not of it. And the aspect of being in this world we're talking about today is the ever-present reality of suffering, and in particular, the question of how is God involved in our suffering? When we're at some of our lowest moments, how are we supposed to think about God? How are we supposed to feel about God in that? And Steve and I have a conversation that I hope will help you think about that in new ways and maybe even be a resource to you when you find yourself in that spot. Let's jump in. Steve, so great to be back with you again. We got a little bit of a heavier topic today. We're going to talk about suffering. Are you ready to get into that?
What a simple topic to tackle, Wyatt. What aspect of suffering is it we're actually going to talk about?
Well, specifically, we're going to get into the question of how God is involved in our suffering, which raises a lot of issues, I think. Some that are just personal and practical, which is how am I supposed to think about God, who's good and powerful and yet allows me to go through really hard things? That's maybe more of like a theological question. Mm-hmm. And then there's just like the emotional questions of, I'm really mad at God that he allows this that I'm going through. But yeah, I think our framework, our model of how we perceive God to be involved in suffering actually ends up being a really important part of our walk with the Lord.
So we're kind of tackling the classic problem of evil here. Like, how does an all perfect yet all loving, all powerful God still allow evil?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's like the ivory tower version of it. I think for most people, it encounters their life of just like, how on earth is this happening to me?
Yeah.
Why is God allowing this? And I think, where I come at this is just as a pastor, where it's very common for me to be walking alongside people in some of the lowest moments of their life in, just excruciating suffering.
Yep.
And trying to figure out something to offer them, which is not always easy because, I should say it's never easy, because in almost every case, I've never experienced anything like what they're going through.
Right.
And so I can't say anything close to like, I get it, or And
even if you did, it probably wouldn't help.
Right.
Yep.
And then I have all this, seminary training, but like, that's not what, they don't need
totally
that.
I'm literally thinking of like me back in my Bible college days and sitting around the theological, philosophical sort of, bull sessions where guys would just argue chapter, verse, philosophical angle. And that has its place, but to your point, it pales in comparison to what it is to sit with somebody who's lost a child or someone who's facing a cancer diagnosis. That's a very different thing.
And so we're going to try to do kind of both these things at once today. So we're going to ask the ivory tower theological question of, okay, just how do we think about God? How do we think about God being involved in our suffering? And then we're also going to get to the more pastoral side of things, which is what is actually some ways to offer comfort to someone who's in this situation, and more than just debating God's sovereignty, what are some of the things that we know to be true about how God's involved in our suffering that are actually helpful to think about in moments like that? So that's the question today. How is God involved in our suffering?
It sounds like a really worthy topic. I mean, when you first brought it up, I'm thinking to myself, oh, great, Wyatt, we're going to tackle like the most difficult theological question of all time. Like classic literature, Milton's Paradise Lost, 500 years ago, he wrote about justifying the ways of God to men. Are we going to add to what he had to say? Probably not.
I say Milton tried, but we're going to succeed. We've got
let's go.
30 minutes, and let's go.
Easy.
So, all right, let's jump into it.
Okay, Wyatt. So we got these two angles. Let's start with what actually might be the easier of the two, which is the philosophical, theological question, which is nice and removed from reality. We're going to sit here and look at it with cold, impartial intellects, correct?
Yeah, how do we think about this? And I think how we kind of got to this episode was actually a passage I was preaching on from 1 Samuel. And the reason why it really jumped out at me is because it is a passage, and there's actually many in the scriptures that do this, but that undermines one of the kind of common ways of thinking about suffering in the world that's actually untrue. So here's the untrue model. The untrue model is that there is kind of this cosmic battle of some kind, and God is responsible and involved in everything that's good in the world. And the devil is responsible and involved in everything that's bad in the world. And so suffering is the result of the devil's work. And everything good in life is the result of God's work. But God would never be involved in the suffering, in the evil of the world. Like he's just distant and removed from that. That is the work of the enemy. And the reason why that's so common, I think, is because on the surface, it's somewhat comforting. It's somewhat comforting to know that if you are experiencing something difficult, it doesn't have anything to do with God. He's not doing that to you or involved in that in any way. Like, that's the devil.
The devil made me do it.
Yeah, sure. And I came across a passage that just basically says the opposite of that. 1 Samuel 1 is the story of Hannah. Hannah desperately wants more than anything in life to have a baby. And she's praying and asking God, and for years and years and years, she never has a baby. And that's a really bad thing in her life for more reasons than even we understand. I mean, we understand at the surface why that's so hard, but like that means her status in society is very low.
In Hebrew culture, that's huge.
Yeah, she's in a polygamous marriage, and the other wife has a bunch of kids, and the other wife is giving her a really hard time and making fun of her, making her life miserable, and so just years and years go by, and she can't have a baby. And this is probably the greatest source of suffering in her life. And you get to 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 6, and the way that the Bible depicts what's happening is that the Lord had kept Hannah from conceiving. That it was actually a direct action of God to not allow her to conceive. And I just want to point out a couple of things about that, okay? It's not that the Lord had refused to miraculously intervene to give her a baby.
Right.
It's that he actually kept it from happening.
He actively played a part.
And so that, I mean, it just immediately blows up the idea that God's not involved in our suffering. It also undermines another misconception, which is that suffering is always the direct result of our sin in some way. So like some people could be totally fine with the fact that God's involved as long as the explanation is that, yeah, he's involved to punish you for what you've done wrong. Like that he's fair, he's just, and when you sin, like he's going to bring some amount of suffering in your life to be the consequence. But that's not anywhere in this story at all. We get no idea that Hannah's been disobedient, that quite the opposite. Like everything about her, we're getting this idea that she's faithful and obedient, and yet despite that, God is keeping her from conceiving and bringing this amount of suffering into her life. And so as you kind of waltz into this passage with your modern, worldview of God not really being involved in the suffering of our lives, this kind of just blows that up. Like God is actually doing this in some way.
Yeah, what totally jumps out at me is what you already covered. I mean, I can live with the idea that God permits certain things to happen. It goes through him, he makes a call, he allows it. But for him to actively be involved, it really stretches a lot of our theological explanations.
Yeah. So let's figure some of those explanations out. How is it that we are to conceive of God's involvement? The Bible is forcing us to the fact that God's involved somehow. How is he involved? And to answer that question, I think we have to acknowledge that there is a huge variety of ways that Christians have wrestled with this very complex topic. And I want to just kind of present people with those options. In simple terms, I guess this isn't that simple of a term. I'll take that back.
Take the word simple out.
In common terms, people may have heard of a theological framework called Calvinism. Mm-hmm. It is a systematic theology that goes back to John Calvin, but that really has a high emphasis on God's sovereignty, and we need to define that. Sovereignty just basically has to do with God's power and his control in the world. So
kings are sovereign, they control things.
Yeah, so same idea behind that word is, okay, how does God exercise his power in the world? How does God rule over all of creation? And if you're more towards this Calvinistic end of trying to explain this theologically, then the concept of how God exercises his power is pretty simple. The definition of sovereignty, according to a Calvinist, would be that God is actively in control of all things at all times. Everything that takes place.
Every minute detail.
And you can see how you get there very easily from a logical standpoint. He's all powerful. He's all knowing. How could he not be the cause behind all things? It's not like anything's out of his control ever. It's not like
he'd be insulting.
Nothing surprises him.
Otherwise,
yeah, exactly. You know, a great friend of mine, a former mentor and pastor of mine, I remember him preaching from the pulpit. There is not a single atom in the universe. There's not an iota. There's not a speck of dust anywhere in this galaxy that God is not actively controlling what it does and where it goes and any of that, you know. So that is the Calvinistic idea of God's sovereignty. And
do you remember the Old Testament story? I wish I could remember exactly which king it was, but it's like a battle where God prophesies that this one king's going to die. And it looks like for the longest time, he's just safe behind the lines. And some guy on the other side, some foot soldier, just randomly launches this arrow, you know, it's high up into the sky, and it just finds its way through the tiniest little hole in his armor. They love to point to that passage.
Exactly. That is a perfect picture of God controlling even the minute details of what's going on to accomplish his purposes. Okay. So, like, I think if you want to kind of imagine how that view has to struggle with this question of suffering, it really brings the morality of God into question in some ways, okay? If God is actively controlling all things, then the question you have to answer is, how is God not directly responsible for evil and suffering, right? If he is not just observing what's taking place, if he's not just allowing even what's taking place, if he's actively controlling all things, how is it that God is not evil? Because he apparently has been directly involved in whatever you want to bring to the table, in the Holocaust, in the worst natural disasters, to the very personal things in your life that have the tragedies that you've experienced. Like this view has to wrestle with this concept of, God planned this from before the beginning of all time. I mean, before you were even born, he intended these things to take place. And what's interesting is I've talked to a number of people who have had this perspective, and even you, Steve. You know, there's a way.
Are you gonna let the cat out of the bag, Wyatt?
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, but what I've found is that truth for some people, or that concept for some people, is deeply unsettling, and for others, it is deeply encouraging. It is comforting. Can you explain, like, how could that concept actually be comforting to you if you're in the midst of suffering?
Yeah, I think the crux of it is, on the one hand, you can imagine like this cruel moral monster God up there, like actually saying, you know what, I think I'm just going to launch this hurricane, or even worse, like allow that child that is so precious to those parents to die. I mean, you can look at it that way, but another way of looking at it is that everything that happens in my life has to go through a good, kind, loving God who will ultimately work everything out for my good and his glory. So a lot of it goes back to how I conceive of why and what he's doing up there. And I do think there's a lot of biblical evidence to suggest, i.e. the book of Job, that he is working good purposes, even when those that are experiencing the suffering don't fully get to know why.
So that's huge. So part of the way that you wrestle with suffering theologically from this perspective is that truth that you can rest assured that though God is the cause of the suffering that you experience,
on some level,
he is the cause. He has good intent, and you may not see it now. You may not ever see it in your lifetime, but like one day when all the information's known,
right,
you will be able to see that God was actually using that suffering for incredible good. And it might be your good, it might be the good of others, it might be, things that you can't even fathom right now. But there's no accidents, there's no mistakes, and because God's good, it means that even the worst suffering has some sort of good purpose in it. I think that's the comfort.
Yeah.
If you want to just like picture this, or an image, an analogy of this view of suffering, it's the view of God as kind of the the great tapestry weaver. So you can imagine, that the story of creation and that everything in the universe is this huge, beautiful tapestry of this amazing image, and God is the one who's woven it all together. And if you zoom in real tight, and we live this like tiny little minuscule part of the universe, and if you zoom in real tight, you might find spots that are just like entirely black darkness, And if that's your whole existence, you're just like, this is the worst thing ever. How could anyone be a part of this if they're good in any way? But once you zoom out, you see that small black speck is actually a necessary part of the beautiful whole. And so that's kind of one end of the theological spectrum. And there's plenty of Bible verses that really get at this. Like, I think one of the ones that I would go to is Isaiah 45:7, where God says, I form light and create darkness. I make success and create disaster. I am the Lord who does all these things. It's God saying, don't ever get confused that like I'm only a part of the good things and I'm not a part of the disasters. No, I make them both. I do them all. And that, for anybody who has encountered that verse in the King James, it sounds even worse. The King James translation is God saying, I make success and I create evil instead of disaster, and I think that's a little bit of an unhelpful interpretation of that Hebrew word. The word there in Hebrew is just ra, which is just the generic Hebrew word for bad, and the context determines a ton of what that badness is. In a moral context, it's evil. I don't think that's God saying, I do evil. That's not a good...
I was on a mission trip in the Philippines with a bunch of Bible school students. It's me and another pastor, and they're able, like, stump the pastor, ask the pastor. They're a King James only school, and this, like, 18-year-old kid reads this verse to me and says, how did God create evil? I looked at Fred Williams, my good friend, and said, hey, Fred, what do you think about that? And I punted.
Yeah, the King James Bible was a great gift of God to the church, but it was also a bad translation.
That was a
bad
translation.
So, yeah. But absolutely, like, is God a part of these things, and does he have a purpose in it? Yes. And there's people and traditions in theology that have really emphasized that. On the other side, and I'm not going to another extreme. I mean, there's people who would say God's never involved in anything evil because, he's actually not all powerful. He's trying his best, but he can't get them all. What do you hope for? And that's heresy. Like we're not going there. But within Orthodox Christianity, you just have a different view of what sovereignty is. So like what we said earlier about Calvinism, the Calvinistic idea of sovereignty is that God is actively controlling all things at all times. This non-Calvinistic view of how God's power is enacted in the world would define sovereignty differently, which is that God's sovereignty means that God does whatever he pleases and nothing can frustrate his will. So that comes directly from Psalm 115:3, but our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. That's what it means that God is all powerful. He can do whatever he wants. And anytime he wants to do something, nothing is ever going to get in his way. There's no power that can keep God from doing what he wants. But where this is an important distinction is that this is a view of God's sovereignty that says, well, it doesn't mean that he's actively controlling all things. It doesn't mean that he's the main cause behind all events. He could if he wants. In any point, he could.
Right.
But he also could, if he pleases, choose to allow human beings the free wills to make real choices that have actual consequences in the world. That might be the reason why certain things are happening.
Which incidentally is an idea that seems to show up pretty early in the story.
Well, so certainly.
Genesis
right? The
2.
garden.
Yeah.
It seems, on its face at least, that the garden is a story of God saying, I'm going to create space for other beings to make free choices.
Exercise their will.
That will have serious effects on the world, including great suffering. I mean, that's the curse of Genesis 3 is, the toil of the ground and the unhealth in human relationships and the pain in childbirth, and suffering is a huge part of that. And you look at some other verses where it seems like God is saying, hey, I didn't want this. This wasn't my action. From the Old Testament, you have some of the ways that God talks about the rebellion of his people. So like you have Jeremiah chapter 19, where God's people have started worshiping foreign gods and they're actually sacrificing their children on the altar to Molech. And this is what God says in Jeremiah 19, verse 5. He says, they have built high places to Baal, not Molech, Baal, on which to burn their children in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal. Something I have never commanded or mentioned. I never entertained the thought, or
I never even thought of it.
Literally, you might say, it never entered my mind.
You guys outdid me. I could never come up with.
And it just, at the very least, it seems like God is saying there, this wasn't me. This was you. Not only did I not command it, I never imagined it. Like, why did you do this? And that seems to be getting at some reality where God is saying, like, I'm not directly causing at least this specific suffering. It might be others that he is, but in this case, it seems like he's kind of saying, like, you got to look somewhere else if you're looking for why this suffering came about.
We may get to more of our own stories, but I mean, I have my own scripture there that comes to mind because my journey has been more of a journey from a very strongly Calvinist background, strong emphasis on God's sovereignty. But I'll never forget reading this for the first time. This is one of those Old Testament verses that you like find buried that no one ever preached on. This is God talking about how he's going to bless Israel after they've returned to him. And he says in Isaiah 54:15, and if anyone attacks you, it's not from me. Whoever attacks you will fall before you. Like, hey, sometimes they attack you because I told them to. There's a bunch of that in the Old Testament. I sent Nebuchadnezzar. I sent King of Assyria. He's like, this time around, all them. Like, I had nothing to do with it. Really weird thought.
Yeah. And now, again, this understanding of God's power and how he's involved specifically in suffering, we'll get back to that. Again, as I've talked with people about this many times, I've found that to some people, this is incredibly comforting, and to some people, it's incredibly unsettling. So the way that this concept is comforting, I think, is it means that God may be every bit as distraught with the suffering that you're experiencing as you are. You know, that Jeremiah 19 passage is basically, that's what God's saying. God's saying, like, I hate this.
Yeah.
Like, this is the worst. I was not a part of this. And there's something comforting about God hating the consequences of sin and evil in the world as much as you hate it. Like, it's hard, I think, to go through something horrible and traumatic and feel like, God, you hate this, but God wanted it. And so that's the comforting aspect. But what's the unsettling aspect of
I
this?
mean, there's a couple of different ways I would think about this sort of unsettling side. We're talking about this mostly from the angle of God's sovereignty in the area of suffering. Like, if you look at it from the angle of God's sovereignty and salvation, that brings up a whole bunch of other questions, but that's probably another podcast. In the area of suffering, like, I'm going to actually go back to the verse I just read. Okay, let's say, you know, someone attacks our nation, and we can go, oh, phew, it wasn't God. God's not in this. But guess what? Like, tons of women and innocent children and all kinds of civilians might be killed in that war. That seems very random and very almost cruel. Like, I'd rather God to know that somehow you're involved in this because stuff is happening here.
Right.
That's awful.
I mean, God didn't protect me from this.
Right.
Why?
He could have.
And maybe it actually puts that doubt in your mind of, could he have? I mean, will he in the future protect me?
Totally.
And that's the unsettling part. You know, what I said earlier is that if you take the more Calvinistic approach, the thing you have to really wrestle with about God is, how is God truly good if he is, in some sense, the direct cause of these bad things? On the flip side, if you're going to take a less Calvinistic approach, the thing you really have to wrestle with God is, how is God truly in control?
Totally.
If he's not the direct cause of all these things. I mean, in some way, doesn't it feel like he's actually not controlling?
You feel so vulnerable.
Yeah. And so I bring that up just because I think it's worth recognizing that our theology matters in some of these really personal things. And there's no one-size-fits-all easy answer to the hardest questions that we're raising about God's goodness and our suffering and God's power in our suffering. But this is, you know, as you are going to, there's no doubt in your life that, like, you are going to experience suffering. I'm going to experience suffering. That's a part of it.
Yep.
And part of what we want to do is help people be prepared for that theologically, of like help people have some handles to think about God and to not be totally caught off guard in those moments and think, man, whatever my view of God was just got blown up by the reality of life, and I'm not sure I can even believe in him anymore. Like, there's more than one way to navigate this, but it is clear that every single author of the scriptures knew full well about suffering, and that what we're taught about God in the scriptures is actually compatible with that. That there is truth to be mined here. There is comfort to be found in learning about who God is and how he acts.
So you want to give Milton a run for his money. We're going to do our best to justify the ways of God to men.
Well, let's try to get back into some waters that are actually maybe more appropriate to our skill set. And having kind of covered the spectrum of how people wrestle with this theologically, let's get to the practical. Let's get to, okay, what are the things that we all agree on? What are the things that the Bible just teaches clearly that can really help us in these moments we find? And so let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll jump into that more pastoral side of this question. All right, Steve, we've done our best here to kind of wrestle through some of the different theological models of thinking about how God is involved in all things, but particularly in suffering, in evil, in hard things. I think pastorally, like probably one of the worst things you could do with somebody who's in the midst of intense suffering is like try to draw them into a theological debate about
the meticulous sovereignty of God.
Yeah, so let's try to move to some things that might be a little bit more helpful to somebody who's actually in the midst of this, because honestly, like the theological debate, not only it may not be helpful, it might actually be hurtful to somebody in that position. Yeah,
that's absolutely true. I mean, I've shared with you a little bit of my own story. We stumbled on this the other day, and I'd kind of forgotten about it, but I'm a freshman in college, missionary kid, just come back from living overseas, feel very alone and struggling with some depression. I go see our school chaplain, and I'm telling him, I'm feeling lonely and depressed, and also that I'm kind of struggling with pride. And he says, I have just the answer for you. You need to read this book. It's called The Sovereignty of God by A.W. Pink. And Wyatt, this guy was probably like a 700-point Calvinist. Talk about meticulous sovereignty. He convinced me not only that God is absolutely sovereign in every remote detail of our lives, but he likes being that way, and we should basically all just roll over and say, you're right, I'm wrong, I shut my mouth. And the crazy thing about that is that it had a huge impact on me. I got more depressed because I couldn't wrap my brain around a God like that. I couldn't live a life where I felt like my choices had absolutely no meaning. And it took a long time. Some of it really took root for me, but it took me a long time to, I think, kind of rebalance my own perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think, your story is probably one of many that are along those same lines. And so I want to close today by just kind of asking the question, what are some of the non-controversial things the Bible says about suffering? What are some of the just rock-solid truths that you can cling to in the midst of suffering that in the right context you could share as an encouragement to someone who's in suffering? And I do want to, we have an earlier episode on pastorally how to minister to people in the midst of suffering. And a big part of that was don't think that step one is sharing biblical truth. So in no way am I trying to deputize people like go share these verses with the person as soon as they, tell you that they're suffering. But that being said, these are truths that can be profoundly helpful to you and others in the midst of suffering. And so let's just start at the top. And it actually goes to kind of one of the unfortunate things that happened to you in that story. The first truth that I would want people to understand is the reality that God does not delight in your suffering. That sometimes it's easy to get this idea that like God somehow is taking pleasure in us suffering, that he's kind of vindictive in some way, or, like the little kid with the magnifying glass and the ants that he's burning on the sidewalk or whatever. And especially, if we've done something wrong, like if we've sinned and as a result of our sin, we're suffering, that God is taking pleasure in that because we're getting what we had coming to us. And God actually specifically denies that. In Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, He says, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Like, sometimes I'm involved in the death of the wicked. He clearly is all over the Old Testament.
Right.
But it's not because he is taking some sort of joy from that. God goes on to say, no, but rather I take joy that the wicked person should turn from his ways and live. God, he doesn't delight in punishing. He doesn't delight in us suffering. He delights in us repenting and coming to him. Another verse I love in this, not often I'm going to the book of Lamentations, but this is from Lamentations chapter 3. Even if he causes suffering, acknowledging that sometimes God does cause suffering, even if he causes suffering, he will show compassion according to the abundance of his faithful love. For he does not enjoy bringing affliction or suffering on mankind. And so if you're ever hearing the whispers of the enemy that, God is loving that you're in this, in this point. He could have stopped this. He didn't because he wanted to watch you squirm. He wanted to, that kind of lie that can so distance you from God in the midst of suffering. One of the things the Bible wants you to know super clearly is that's just not how God is. He doesn't delight in this.
Yeah, I remember in that aforementioned book, and I do not mean to diminish someone like A.W. Pink. He was a great theologian and a very godly man.
He also probably listens to this show, so be careful, Steve.
You never know. He died in 1919, but that's okay. He went to great lengths to quote a lot of those Old Testament verses that would show a vengeful, wrathful God delighting in the death of the wicked. And there are some of those verses in there, and that's where some of this gets really tough to wrestle with, because you're trying to sort out, how do I put all that together? But these kinds of verses, either there's something I'm missing or God's contradicting himself, and we're 100% sure the latter is not true.
Right.
So you lean heavily into these kinds of verses.
So yeah, that's the truth. One, God's not absent. God does not delight in your suffering. The second thing I would want people to understand is that God is not absent in your suffering. Now, that's kind of been the point we've been talking about, that God's actually involved in your suffering in some way. But the unquestioned good of that is that when you're in the midst of suffering, it is not because